All right, let's talk briefly about psychopharmacology. Some of you, Megan, you can take a nap during this chapter. Brandon, you as well. Bethany, are you in my psychopharm class? Yeah. Anybody else that I've missed? It's because I didn't like you. I'm just kidding. All right, so we'll talk briefly about psychopharmacology, drug action, and neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. Okay. Hey, how many of you are drug users? I always like to ask that question. Yeah. Thanks for being honest. I'm assuming most of you are. There might be a few of you who are not, like for religious reasons. You object to some drug use, but really, a drug is any kind of chemical you put in your body that alters the functions of your cells, right? Anything that you put in your body from outside, right? That's what we mean by exogenous. That's a pretty broad definition, right? So, how many of you have ever been to Starbucks? Yeah, you guys are the biggest drug users ever. And that's because they put somewhere between, 300 and 10 million milligrams of caffeine in everything they sell you. It's even in the napkins. You just absorb it transdermally. You grab a napkin, start shorting out over there. That's why I don't even walk in the place. It's like aerosol. Just snorting up some caffeine, right? That's not true, Megan. I have nothing against Starbucks. I don't own any stock in Starbucks or their competitors. So please continue to, your coffee drinking behaviors, your own business.
I was wondering if you would consider salt chemical in the absence of sodium, in the presence of sodium, that does alter the physiological processes and cellular function.
Man, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. Because if you're going to consider salt, then you have to consider glucose, right? And I think that's really getting into a nutrient sort of thing. Does that make sense?
I've heard different arguments.
Yeah, no, I think for our purposes, no, I'm not going to consider salt a drug. Because I think that's required for basic cellular function. And if it's required for basic cellular function, I don't think it's a drug in the normal situation. Obviously, there are folks who have to take drugs because they don't create the normal things that they need. That's a separate sort of odd situation. I would fall down on the no, salt is not a drug side. That's me. Is that okay? I'm not going to ask you that, but it's an interesting question. All right, so with the exception of salt, I'm just going to... Is that okay? So, drug, it's some exogenous chemical you're going to put in your body. What's a drug effect? That's going to change your behavior and your physiology, right? That's the effect of the drug, okay? If you take caffeine, what's an effect? It's going to increase your heart rate, right? It's going to make you a little hyperactive. It's going to make you do a few other things. It has to work somewhere, right? That's called the site of action. Just wherever that molecule of the drug is going to interact with that part of your body, those cells of your body, right? And it's going to play around with some biochemical process. It's that simple. Now, the important thing about drugs is it is an exogenous chemical, right? And if there's a thing called an exogenous, then there are also things called endogenous, right? And what does that mean? It means it's from inside your body, right? One of the great examples I like to think about are cannabinoids. How many of you have heard of those? Yeah, most people, right? So there are really two sources. Well, for our purposes in this discussion, we'll think about two sources for cannabinoids, right? You have endocannabinoids. You create things inside your body that are chemically similar to cannabis. That's why cannabis works when you take it, right? Because it interacts and it's shaped close enough to the things you already make in your body to act on those cells, right, on those receptors. If you didn't have receptors shaped that way, take all the cannabis you want, it's never going to cause any effect, right? Because you don't have a receptor for it to interact. You don't have a site of action for it to do its drug effect, okay? So you have endogenous cannabinoids. You also have phytocannabinoids. Those are things you get from plants, right? That's where most people think about getting those. Opioids are the same way. You have endogenous opioids. You stump your toe, you're going to release some endogenous opioids. Now, they are in no way as good as morphine, right? But they will mediate pain in a very, very similar fashion. Different magnitude, same mechanisms, okay? In order for a drug you take to work, it has to mimic something you already make inside your body. For our purposes, that's what we're gonna really think about. Does that make sense to everybody? Awesome. So when we think about drugs, right, there are really sort of four things we want to think about. We need to absorb the drug, we need to distribute the drug, we need to break that drug down into things that are no longer that drug, and then we need to get rid of that drug. Okay? There are many ways we can absorb a drug, and most of you have probably taken drugs in more than one way, right? How many of you have had a medication delivered through an IV or through an intramuscular injection, right? How many of you take Flonase? Yeah, you guys are snorters, right? So you take it intranasally. If you've also taken caffeine, right, through a beverage, then you've taken something orally, right? These are different routes of administration. We'll talk about some of those, why that's important. There's really only one way to distribute that drug throughout your body, right? There are a couple systems that really go everywhere. The one that we typically think about is the circulatory system, right? So once you get that drug, you want to get it into your blood supply, and that guy goes everywhere, right? And so you can hop on at any point and just keep riding around, right, until you get to where you belong. Metabolize, we're going to take that drug and we're going to break it down into things that are no longer going to be active. Okay? And then we're going to give that to the kidneys, which is where we give most everything that we want to excrete, right? And then you send that out through urine. So that's exciting, right? How many of you have ever taken a substance and then your urine was a different color later? Yeah, happens all the time. Multivitamins, beets, asparagus, apparently it's a big culprit. Such. This is actually an eye test. If you can't read this, I don't know why the quality of this is so poor. But basically it's just telling you the same four things that I just told you, kind of putting that in order. All right, let's talk about routes of administration. I'm not going to ask you to memorize every single one of these or what drugs are administered in different ways, but we do want to think about why we would use different routes of administration and what are some key advantages or disadvantages to certain routes, right? So, Michael, first we've got IV injections, right? If you want to get this into your blood supply, what's the quickest way to get there is, well, directly into your blood supply, right? So an IV injection. Okay. Lots of drugs are administered through an IV, right? A lot of drugs of abuse are administered through IV, right? They're using hypodermic syringes, right? Straight into the blood supply. The reason, when you start to think about drugs of abuse, and we'll start thinking about this later, the reason they're administered often through some of these ultra-fast delivery routes is because you really want to couple the experience. Somebody's like birthing a pterodactyl. I don't know what that noise was. But that's what I imagine a pterodactyl would sound like if it just, hatched out of an egg. If anybody's a pterodactyl fan. I am. Emotional response, And then I went back and decided it was because of the beak. It's the head shape of the pterodactyl. It just makes it so wonderful. So, IV injection, going to be fast. If you inject it into a vein, that's going to get pretty quickly to your brain, right? It's going to be awesome. It's going to have a pretty rapid effect, okay? What about intraperitoneal? This is not a real common one for humans. Mostly you're going to give a rat an injection in its gut, right? So basically you're just jabbing it in the abdominal cavity. There are some human medications that will go in that way, but not many. Intramuscular, I would say most of you have had a shot either in your either in your shoulder, your deltoid, or right in your butt, right? So that's kind of something. Subcutaneous, we've got to go under the skin. Oral, that's going to be something that you take like a pill or a liquid. That's great. It's cheap. It's easy. You can do this at home, right? You don't need to hit yourself with a needle. The problem is, I don't know, how many of you have ever been inside of a stomach? There's something really awesome in there. It's called hydrochloric acid, right? Okay. You don't want to pour this stuff on your arm, right? Because it can cause some trouble. There are certain things that will be destroyed by hydrochloric acid, so you can't take those drugs that way. Sublinguals, you put it under your tongue and you kind of absorb it through a mucous membrane. This is different than oral administration. Intrarectal, that works for folks who can't swallow Works for babies. I don't know if you've ever tried to give a baby a pill. I never have, but I can imagine it's difficult, and you can't get them to do much else. Or if you are nauseous and they try to give you an anti-nausea medication, doesn't make a lot of sense, right, to take it down where you're spewing out. So put it somewhere else where you can absorb that quickly and get that out to your blood supply. Inhalation, right? So we think about smoking things or sort of aerosol sort of breathing treatment situations. Different than intranasal or snorting, right? Snorting, we're still going through a mucous membrane, right? So snorting and inhalation are two different things. I think that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. Topical administration. How many of you use the Tiger Balm? I don't know. Somebody uses Tiger Balm. That was sort of an odd brand. How many of you use Icy Hot, right? Lidocaine creams. Any of those sort of like rub-on things that alleviate pain. That's going to be topical administration. These last two, some of the other ones you think, well, that intrarectal doesn't sound like a lot of fun. But I'm going to tell you it's probably a lot more fun than if you need to have an intracerebral or intracerebroventricular administration, right? This is going directly into the brain, okay? So I would try to avoid this. Sounds like a good idea, right? I don't like to let people drill holes in my brain, in my skull, and then poke around. Although, Megan, I've got a video of my uncle's cerebral bypass surgery. It's pretty cool. Yeah, they cut part of his skull out and had to reroute some blood supply. He had a weird stroke while he was having open heart surgery.
Do you watch it like Thanksgiving?
Huh?
Do you watch it like Thanksgiving?
We don't really get together for Thanksgiving much anymore. But maybe next year. I'm thinking about it. I just watch it at home. Got a projector. Pop some popcorn. Get some Sour Patch Kids. All right, here's an awesome diagram. This is pretty important. Again, I don't want you to memorize the numbers or think about things, but this is a good conceptual sort of diagram. This is different routes of administration of cocaine, right? For those of you that aren't aware, there is more than one way you can take cocaine, right? So there you go. And each way's got its own fun names. One of those ways is intravenous. So if you look at this, if you look at IV, look at how quickly you get that nice spike in concentration, right? So you get that rapid sort of effect. Now it sort of tails off a little bit. Okay. Here is, let's see what's that. And that's intranasal, so that's snorting, right? You also have smoking, right? Notice you don't get as high of a concentration, it sort of tails off. And then here are those famous cocaine pills, right? I don't think anybody takes cocaine pills, right? I mean, that's not a real way to take it typically. But that's oral administration of cocaine. And you can kind of see why you wouldn't want to take it that way. Look at the time delay. That's like an hour, right? So, I mean, you've taken a cocaine pill, and then you're like, oh, man, well, I got an hour. I guess I'll go pick up my dry cleaning. Maybe I'll grab a sandwich. I don't know. And then, like, all of a sudden on the way home, you're just, well, now it's working. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? I mean, you don't really want to have to plan your day that far. If you're like, oh man, I just want to hit a cocaine. You want it now, right? You're not gonna. Nobody wants to wait. Nobody wants that slow-acting cocaine, right? You want that fast-acting, rapid effect, right? And that's why, again, IV administration for drugs of abuse, and they have that high addiction potential. You want that effect right at that moment. If that effect happened later, if all drugs of abuse, you didn't get the effect for an hour later, nobody'd ever become addicted, right? Because who knows what you're doing in an hour? It's some random behavior, right? It's never going to be the same. But if you're injecting and then you're getting that effect pretty quickly, well, every time you're you're creating that loop, right? And you're creating that sort of behavioral learning. And so we'll talk about that later. But that's an important kind of concept to hold on to. And you can apply this to a lot of other drugs. Cocaine just happens to be one that works. Most people have heard of it. There are other drugs you could do the same way. Don't worry about this. So once we have absorbed that drug into our blood supply, we send that out to its site of action. For our purpose, we're going to think about the brain for just about every site of action for these drugs, right? We're going to go right up to the brain. we're going to do something, we're going to affect the way those brain cells are operating. We'll talk about that later. Once we've done that, those molecules are continuing to travel around and continue to do things. Okay? We're eventually going to get that mostly to your liver. And typically you've got a bunch of enzymes in your liver that are going to grab onto those drugs. They're going to rip them in half into something that is not the drug, right? Something that's no longer going to have an effect on you. Something that's going to be less lipid soluble, so that's going to be important. Remember before when we talked about the blood-brain barrier, we talked about lipid solubility. Did we discuss that in this class? Okay. Thanks, Christina. We appreciate the head nod. Once you have deactivated a drug, it needs to be less lipid soluble. The reason for that is you're going to stick it in your kidneys. And your kidneys, like most everything else in your body, it's made of lipids. And if that metabolite is lipid soluble, it's going to slide right back out of there into your blood supply and go around and start doing some things, right? So it needs to be less lipid soluble so we can stick it in the kidneys and we can get it out through urine. So that's going to be fun, right? Who loves urinating? Nobody wants to own up to that, but you should, right? I mean, it's like that's something that should be rewarding to you, right? How many of you still get an M&M if you... It's a joke. You guys prefer stickers instead? My best friend's son, you have a little trouble with the potty training. He gets these like Batman stickers. If he goes like a whole day without, like going in his pants. I don't know. It's a lot of stickers you guys could rack up, right? I mean, some of you more than others, but that's the way it goes. All right. So dose response curve. Hey, this is pretty straightforward. We give somebody a dose and they have a response. Most of the time, if we give you a bigger dose, guess what happens? You get a bigger response, right? Now, there's some limit to that. Okay. Caffeine's a great example. If I give you a bunch of caffeine up to a certain point, heart rate continues to increase, you reach some plateau, right? Therapeutic index. This is important. How many of you love to take drugs that will kill you? Nobody. Nobody does that. Therapeutic index is the gap between the dose that will kill you and the dose that will make you feel better, right? The wider that gap, the better, the safer the drug, right? Okay. When the gap is narrow, that means that drug is more dangerous, right? You have to be careful. And then we also have this concept of affinity. That's sort of the readiness with which two molecules join together, right? This is really important when we think later about drugs and we think about how effective those drugs are. This is important for like opioids, right? There are a ton of opioids. Some of those are natural, some are synthetic, right? Each of those has a different affinity for the opioid receptor, okay? And there have been folks, for those synthetic drugs, there have been folks who have designed those drugs in a way that they can change the affinity, right? So they can change how strongly they operate and attach to those opioid receptors. All right, there's your dose response curve. Give you a low dose, you get a low response. Up to a certain point, give you higher doses, you get higher responses. This is for morphine, right? If you have some pain, we give you some morphine, you feel better. If we give you too much morphine, you stop breathing. Okay? So if you're going to a good medical professional, they should give you some dose of morphine there in the middle, right? Enough to make you feel better, but not so much you stop breathing. Seems reasonable, right? This is actually based on something called LD50, which is the lethal dose for like 50% of the population, and ED50, effective dose for half the population. Now, Scotty's thinking like, oh man, I don't want to go in the doctor and tell me like, you take this drug, you got a 50-50 chance of dying. You also got a 50-50 chance of feeling better. That doesn't sound good, right? So for most people, you actually want a lethal dose 1 and an effective dose 99, right? So you want a dose, this dose only kills 1% of the population. So that makes you feel pretty good, right? I can take that dose, I got a 1% chance of dying. But I've got a 99% chance of feeling better. I'll take those odds, right? Let's talk about tolerance a little bit. If you keep taking a drug, you have to take more of that drug over time to get the same effect. There are a couple mechanisms at play that make that happen. One of those is we always have to think about homeostasis first. right? So you have a certain set point of activity, set point of operation, and you want to stay there. Okay? When you take a drug that moves you away from that, your body's going to try to compensate, right? It's going to move you up or down. So for tolerance, if you keep taking a drug, one thing we can do is we can drop the number of receptors for that particular molecule, right? So that's great, right? So I can reduce the number of receptors that are sensitive to that drug. You're flooding me with that drug. You're going to overactivate those receptors, but you're overactivating less of them, right? So I can kind of mediate that effect. So that's why over time you have to take more and more of the drug because you're losing those receptors. You don't have as many to operate anymore. So you have to activate the ones you do have even more powerfully, more often. The other thing that happens sometimes is called enzyme induction. Okay. As you continue to ingest a particular substance, alcohol is a great example. Over time, you'll start to create more of the enzyme that breaks down alcohol, right? It's called alcohol dehydrogenase. So guess what? The next time you have some alcohol, you've got more alcohol dehydrogenase. It's going to break down that alcohol faster, so it has less of an effect. Okay? So you have to take more of that alcohol to have that same effect. Does that make sense? I think this is the point where I should tell you guys to drink responsibly. Am I required to do that? Okay.
Really, you're saying drink regularly, right? If you want to increase the concentration of alcohol.
Yeah, so in fact, probably drinking a moderate amount regularly is better than binge drinking, right? If you don't drink for 2 weeks and then all of a sudden you're like, case of Natty Light tonight, guys. That's a bad idea. But if you have a glass of wine or a craft beer with dinner, 3 or 4 times a week, that's probably okay. Seems reasonable, right? I don't know. There's a lot of research on that goes both ways, right? Like I read an article and it's like, don't drink, you'll die early. And then the next article is like, drink more, you'll live longer. Well, which is it? Because I got a fridge full of stuff here, I got to do something with it. I don't know. And that's really going to be important for my life insurance policy, right? Do I want a whole life or do I need a term life? What do I need to do here? Because I can't take it back at the store. Megan, does that make sense to you? No?
Well, to build the concentration, it just sounded like constant would be a better option.
Yeah, I mean, I think regularly drinking 6 beers is a bad idea, right? Because that's too much. Like if you're like, I'm going to have 6 a day, right? Every day. That's probably going to kill you. But if you're like, 1 a few times a week is probably okay. So you can kind of keep that level in. And I think that is a problem because people, you've got, I don't know. You guys don't know what you're doing out there in the world. And that's a real problem. And by the time you figure it out, you've already done the damage, right? You're like, oh man. If I'd known that 10 years ago, definitely wouldn't have jumped off the top of that car. But you didn't understand gravity, so learn your lesson. That's why you have to have one pant leg pinned a little bit more than the others, right? You got one leg just a little bit shorter now than the other leg. It happens, don't worry about it. Sensitization I'm not going to worry about. Basically the idea there is you don't develop tolerance to everything, and in fact some things you become more sensitive to over time, right, Casey? So you're like, oh, I've been doing whatever for a long time, and then that response actually gets worse. Hey, withdrawal, that's a fun one. How many of you have gone through that? You don't have to answer. I think everybody has. How many of you have tried to quit caffeine? Everybody's done that, right? I'm going to quit. And then you have these headaches or something. Caffeine withdrawal is a little different because caffeine's one of those things that typically magnitude of withdrawal is related to how long and how much of a substance you've used. Caffeine's a weird one because that's not really usually the case, right? Even more caffeine, higher caffeine use doesn't necessarily correlate with higher withdrawal symptoms or worse withdrawal symptoms. Basically, the problem with withdrawal is because you spent all this time developing tolerance, right? So you've got these awesome enzymes that are ramped up, cut down your receptors big time, and all of a sudden you stop taking cocaine. And instead of having those artificially elevated dopamine levels, you've got these artificially reduced dopamine levels, right? And you feel horrible, okay? This is why it's so difficult once you're addicted to a drug to actually stop, right? Why did you take the drug in the first place? Well, it was to feel better, right? And then all of a sudden you're going to stop taking it and you're going to feel worse for who knows how long. Well, what's the quickest remedy to feeling better? Well, it was taking that drug, so why not start taking it again, right? And this is why folks will continue to kind of have these, they go through withdrawal and then or start withdrawal symptoms and then they just go back to using the drug again, right? It happens. How many of you still use caffeine even though you tried to quit? Yeah, like all of you. It's like the same number of hands, right? Caffeine's probably not a problem. If you're trying to quit another substance, then I'd recommend getting some professional help, right? If you're drinking so much caffeine you are shaking, get some professional help, but otherwise I think you're probably okay. Casey, do they help folks with addiction issues at the clinic?
Generally we would refer.
You would refer that out?
Yeah, some stuff, I think we've seen some people with like marijuana use disorder, but other ones, most of it is severe and I think it's
All right. Sorry. This is why I don't play cards anymore. It's like my face is, and I lose a lot of money, so I stick to other games. Yeah. I'm still hearing that pterodactyl, aren't you, Jacob? That's like, is there anybody who knows what that noise is?
I think it's fine to us. It's very sweet.
Seriously?
Yeah.
That is. I'm going to bring in like some household oil next week or something. And like really, I don't know. Casey, that seems like a job for a teaching assistant.
duly noted.
Desk lubing. That's for you.
Get it on Amazon.
Desk lube? I didn't know that was a thing they made.
WD-40 will probably.
WD-40, yeah, let's use that instead. It's a little spray nozzle and everything.
Yep.
All right. So, what can they go to the clinic for? Because I love to advertise for the clinic.
I think anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, more things like this. A lot of drugs have really severe withdrawal symptoms that we're concerned about.
Yeah, you would have to have some medical assistance for that, right? Especially alcohol, right? So that's like a big one. If you are an alcoholic, I'm not going to say like keep drinking, but I'm also not going to say like just stop drinking all of a sudden because that's going to kill you. Because their withdrawal can actually be fatal for some drugs. So if you are using a serious substance and you're at the point where you need to stop doing that, then definitely seek some professional help on it. For other sort of problems, though, we have over in Harris Hall. This is amazing, and I always try to let people know this. There's a psychology clinic over there. I don't know if you guys have been there. It's free for students. I mean, what's it cost to go? It's like $100 some to go talk to a mental health professional. They're giving away $100 every time you go up there, basically, right? I mean, that's what it works out to, Dylan.
Pretty much.
Pretty much. That's the way it works. Your bank account gets bigger, I promise. Great advertisement. But if you guys or someone you know is having some difficulties, please refer them over there. Head that way yourself. Stop by, pick up a pamphlet. If they can't help you, they'll find somebody who can. Is that your slogan?
Yeah. Sounds good.
Right now the slogan is "Do not give up," and there are a bunch of like sailing themed things on the wall. No comment. Did you do that?
I did not do that.
You did not do that.
I have no involvement in the
Yeah.
sailboat.
No involvement in sailboating. All right, so hey, who loves placebo effects? Yeah, your moms. That's who. How many times have you like scraped your knee and your mom kissed your knee? You're like, oh, this will feel better, and it does, right? It works. It's effective, right? That's a placebo effect. Okay, there you go. Basically, you take something that in no way should make things better, but it does anyway, right? That's a placebo. There are a ton of things that can actually make this happen. There are actually brain regions that are involved in the placebo effect. So your brain's actually doing something, right, during the placebo effect, right? It's not just you thinking things are getting better, right? I feel like that's sort of a all surface level explanation of what's going on. There's specific brain regions, we'll see that in a minute, that get involved with this. This is often used as a control group in research, right? You'll see placebos used, right, to make sure that the medication they're testing is actually causing that effect, that improvement. This is one of the reasons it's difficult to get an antidepressant to market, right? Because the placebo group seems to work just as well, right? telling people they'll take something that will make them feel better seems to work just as well as giving them something that will actually make them feel better. And you don't have to worry about the side effects, right? There are some serious side effects to antidepressants, even the sort of safer, I don't want to use the really word safer, the ones with less severe side effect profiles like SSRIs, right, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They've got some fun side effects like you sleep a lot, you gain some weight, and sexual dysfunction, which those are phenomenal for getting you out of a depressive slump, let me just tell you. Nothing knocks somebody out of depression like gaining weight and not being able to have sex. So often the placebos work almost as well, and there's not those side effects to worry about. So they'll, from an approval standpoint, they'll definitely have some difficulty getting those to market. The problem with that is then, maybe they actually had a substance that was pretty good that could have been helpful, and they often don't make it out there for folks to take them. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, doing that. But there you go. So that's placebo. There's also a thing called a nocebo effect. You guys don't really need to know much about that, but for those of you that might ask, it's when you can have like side effects if you start. There's actually evidence that says if you focus or think about too much the side effects of a drug, then you'll actually have more severe side effects as well. So it's kind of the opposite of the placebo there. Something to watch out for. That's not me telling you to avoid knowing about side effects. You should know about side effects for any medication that you take, right? So you can watch out for severe things that are happening. But, try not to focus on that more than necessary. All right. Let's talk a little bit about sites of drug action, what drugs do, how they do it, where they do it, and go from there. Right? Now, for our purposes, when we're thinking about psychoactive drugs, we can really break these guys up into two broad categories. It's either going to be an agonist or an antagonist, right? And then there are some like fancy subsets here, okay, that we're not going to really have to worry about too much, all right? So Paris, we have agonists, we have antagonists. That's it. We have things called partial. We'll talk about those as we need to, okay? And I guess I'll write partial now here too. Basically, an agonist is anything that increases the effect of the neurotransmitter system it's working on, right? And so it's going to increase. If you're a dopamine agonist, you increase the effects of dopamine. If you're a serotonin agonist, you increase the effects of serotonin. Okay? It's that simple. You can do this in about 10 different ways, literally. About 10 different ways. We'll talk about those. But the end result's always going to be the same. Activity or the effect, the end result is going to be an increase in that particular neurotransmitter system. Doesn't mean there's an increase in release necessarily, because there are other things we can do to mimic that effect, right? An antagonist is the exact opposite. We are going to decrease the activity of that particular neurotransmitter system. If you're a serotonin antagonist, a dopamine antagonist, if you're an acetylcholine antagonist, you're going to prevent or reduce the activity of those neurotransmitter systems. And that's really it. When it comes down to it, you need to ask yourself a question. Did this drug increase or decrease the activity of that neurotransmitter system? And that will tell you whether or not it's an agonist or an antagonist. Again, there are multiple ways this can happen, but that's all you need to know. Okay? So there are all kinds of ways this can happen, right? We could affect the production of neurotransmitters. So maybe we could provide you with what we call precursors, right? Things that you use to make a neurotransmitter. L-dopa is a precursor for this guy called dopamine. Folks who have Parkinson's disease will often give them L-dopa first, right? You give them more L-dopa, they make more dopamine, they're okay for a while, okay? That's a dopamine agonist, right? We're increasing the amount of dopamine that's created. We can change the way neurotransmitters are stored in vesicles, right? We could either make that easier or make it more difficult. We could block those vesicle transporters. Again, we're influencing the movement and the activity of that neurotransmitter system. Okay? It's not a big deal. Some of these drugs can change the release, right? How many of you love botulism? Nobody? Nobody's a botulism fan? Some people are, right? There are sort of three groups of people who love botulism. Well, I guess there's four, because you got to think about those people trying to kill you. So there are four groups of people who love botulism. There are folks with wrinkly faces, folks with sweaty armpits, and folks who have migraines. Botulism is for all those. And then there are those people who try to kill you. So watch out for those. Botulism prevents the release of neurotransmitters, right? Particularly we're thinking about acetylcholine. And some drugs, alcohol is an example, cocaine is an example, they actually trigger the release of neurotransmitters. So they're going to be an agonist, right? They're going to kind of dump out a bunch of dopamine or something and make something happen. Here's another vision test for you. This autumn, in fact, is actually a beautiful slide and diagram, and I actually think this is very important. Basically, it takes everything I've been telling you and puts it all in one place, right? So if you want to think about specific ways that agonists or antagonists work, you can look at this diagram, and it will tell you everything you need to know. Okay. So basically, it tells you if it increases or if it decreases the activity of that neurotransmitter system and where it does that. It can be in the production process, it can be in storage, it can be during release, it can be after release, right? Because we have a process called reuptake. We talked about reuptake, right? And enzymatic deactivation. Okay. You can affect both of those systems as well, right? We already talked about those guys called SSRIs. Those are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We're going to block the reuptake of that serotonin, leaving it out there at the synapse longer to do its business, right? Sort of a straightforward process. SSRIs don't work for everybody. They don't work for people with faulty serotonin transporters, right? So if your serotonin transporter system is sort of screwed up or doesn't work right, you're going to take an SSRI, it's going to be wasting your time. Sometimes they'll do these genetic panels to see if you have a serotonin transporter that works properly. And if it doesn't, then, try something else. SSRIs are going to be a waste of your time. Okay. All right. So we should think about a couple things. What we call a direct agonist or direct antagonist. This is a guy that's going to do what we call competitive binding. It's going to bind at the same site as its neurotransmitter, whatever that is, right? It's going to bind at the same location. The drug and the neurotransmitter are going to compete for that same binding location. That's why it's competitive. Okay? If it's non-competitive, then the neurotransmitter binds at one location and the drug binds somewhere else. Okay? It's that simple. They're not competing, Scotty. They're going to two different places, right? That doesn't mean that that drug is any more or less effective. It just means it works in a different way. Okay?
Can you say that one more time? I'm so sorry.
That's okay. So, if it is a competitive binding situation, right, with the direct, what we call direct agonist or antagonist,
So the neurotransmitter and
they're both trying to go to the same location. And so they're going to fight it out, right? This is where affinity becomes really important, right? Okay. Because if the affinity of that drug is higher than the affinity of the natural neurotransmitter, then that drug's going to win out more often. Okay. This is why those folks in lab coats like biochemists and whatnot, they will take a drug, and I don't know, it's got some whatever shape, doesn't matter. Okay, and then they'll say, hey, what if I take this little bit and move it over here? Does that increase or decrease the affinity of that drug? And does that increase its competitiveness during that binding process? For the indirect binding or indirect agonist or antagonist, non-competitive binding, it's going to a different location. Doesn't matter if the neurotransmitter binds to that receptor or not, right? If the drug binds to it, the drug's going to do its business. Okay? In this case, affinity is not that important. The drug's going to bind, the drug's going to have its effect, whatever it is, because nothing else is competing for that binding site. Does that make sense? All right, we already talked about that. We should talk about some specific neurotransmitters. Again, the same idea is going to apply here that we were applying in Chapter 3. I really just want to introduce you to these guys so you kind of know in general what they're doing. We'll talk about specific applications as we get to those systems where that's important. Okay? First, we've got this guy called glutamate. Glutamate is awesome. It's the main excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. There are different kinds of glutamate receptors. We'll talk about those. Particularly, we'll talk about the NMDA and AMPA receptors when we talk about learning and memory. Okay. What makes glutamate excitatory, right? What makes anything an excitatory or an inhibitory neurotransmitter, right? It's all about the ion channel. Okay. In this case, these guys will open either sodium or calcium channels. Both of those are cations, both of those are positive. So when those cells, or when those ion channels open, they drive those cells closer to that action potential, right? Okay, so they drive them closer to that threshold of excitation, so it makes it an excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA, on the other hand, is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. What makes it inhibitory? It opens chloride channels. Chloride is going to make the inside of that cell more negative. It's going to hyperpolarize it. It's going to move it farther away from that action potential. So it's going to make it less likely to fire an action potential. Right? What are some things that work on the GABA system? How many of you have heard of benzodiazepines? Okay. One of the they're basically used as a sedative, right? Not a big deal there. Here's some other neurotransmitter systems. Hold on a second. So it's a nice little chart. We can think about that. This is just the structure of an NMDA receptor. We'll talk a lot more about that later. Here's the site for glutamate to bind. This guy will open up, and then we've got to kick out that magnesium. But that's a whole story for later. There's the GABA receptor. Again, we've got a GABA binding site. And then there are places where benzodiazepines can bind or alcohol. All right. So we've talked GABA, we've talked glutamate. We think about those as excitatory, inhibitory. The other neurotransmitters we don't typically think of as strictly excitatory or inhibitory. But we'll think about that as we need to. The next guy we want to think about those acetylcholine. Right? This is kind of important, as a major role in muscle contractions. I don't know if any of you guys do muscle contractions. Like everybody, I think that's how you got here. You contracted muscles. That's different than contracting measles. Just to let you know, they're two different things. One you should do, the other you shouldn't. Okay. So, what else does acetylcholine do, though? It really plays a major role in what we call cortical arousal, right? And we'll talk about this during the sleep chapter, right? So acetylcholine is going to keep your cortex amped up, ready to roll. It's going to play a big role in learning and memory. We'll talk about that. I've already mentioned its role in sleep, right? So it's definitely going to be important there. Here's the acetylcholine pathway. These are sort of the major sources of that. Notice they go a lot of places: cortex, hippocampus, right, amygdala. Pretty broad distribution there of acetylcholine. This is, and we'll see this repeated with other neurotransmitter systems. This is why it's difficult. If someone has a reduction in a neurotransmitter in one particular pathway, That's why it's difficult to treat it with let's just give them more acetylcholine, right? Well, the problem is we're gonna ramp up acetylcholine in these other places as well. It's so systemic, right? It can really cause some problems. This is just basically showing you the synthesis of acetylcholine. Keep in mind, these are some places where agonists or antagonists can do some business, right? They can go in here and they can make some tweaks. They can increase, the availability of either of these precursors. They can reduce the activity of an enzyme. They can do all kinds of things. And there's the breakdown of the acetylcholine esterase. Here's some drugs that act on the acetylcholine system. If you don't like botulism, what about black widow spider venom? It's a fun one too, right? I wouldn't worry about this too much. Anybody really afraid of spiders? Oh, that's great. Next week we're going to bring some in. Just kidding. I don't think you have to really worry about black widow venom too much, right? I mean, don't really see a lot of these things crawling all over your body, while you're asleep or something and trying to eat up your arms or whatever they do. So it's just not really a problem. Interestingly, so both of these will eventually, if you get enough, both will eventually kill you, right? But they do it in two different ways. So botulism will prevent the release of acetylcholine, whereas black widow spider venom actually stimulates the release of acetylcholine. So if you're bitten by or you have enough of that spider venom go in you, then what you're going to do is you're going to have a flood of acetylcholine. You're actually going to have convulsions. And eventually you're going to be paralyzed because you're going to eventually dump out all the acetylcholine that you've got available. And guess what happens then? No muscle contractions. That's fun, right? Hey, what about the monoamines? That's a fun group, right? The monoamines. It sounds like some 60s British rock group. I don't know. Just don't think about those things like I do, right? That's too bad. Dopamine is kind of the major player here, right? So dopamine, what does dopamine do, right? It's involved with just about everything. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We've already talked about the L-DOPA story in Parkinson's disease, but L-DOPA is involved in reward pathways, right? We can think about it in terms of addiction. We'll talk about lots of other times when dopamine is important. There are two other related neurotransmitters to dopamine. That's going to be norepinephrine and epinephrine, right? Sometimes called noradrenaline and adrenaline. Both of these are coming out of the adrenal gland, right? Got that guy on top of your kidneys. That's why you call it an adrenaline rush, right? So it's kind of the same thing there. Again, there are three sort of major pathways with dopamine. This guy's involved in Parkinson's, and the other guys are going to be like reward pathways, attention, and things like that. Again, we're at Parkinson's disease. We don't need to revisit that. Here again is showing you sort of those major pathways with dopamine and where that goes. Again, we've got a bunch of stuff in cortex, hippocampus, other places. This is again the problem. If you are losing dopamine in this pathway, let's just give you more dopamine. Well, you start to increase dopamine here, and you run the risk of developing schizophrenic-like symptoms, right? Well, what if you have too much dopamine up here because you have schizophrenic symptoms? Well, let's just give you something that knocks down your dopamine levels, right? Phenomenal. Until we knock down your dopamine levels so low here, we've given you a movement disorder, right? And so you're constantly kind of moving and bouncing around there. This is where, remember, we talked about partial agonist and partial antagonist. This is where those guys really play a major role. Let's give you something that's pretty good, but not too good, right? We might raise all of your dopamine levels a little bit. That's fine, but we'll definitely raise them a bunch there where you don't have anything, and we can maybe alleviate some Parkinson's symptoms without giving you schizophrenia. Opposite, if you're going to use a partial antagonist, we'll knock down this a little bit, but we're not going to knock down your that input to your basal ganglia so much that you develop a movement disorder. Just drop it enough, just enough to alleviate some hallucinations or something. Now that's much easier said than done, so I just want to be clear about that. Don't just think you can like, hey, hey, I've been hearing some voices, why don't you give me one of those, partial antagonist things you got there on the shelf, and let's see if that works. There's a lot more involved in that. I don't need to make light of that. Don't worry about that too much. Monoamine oxidase, this is a guy we talked about, I think, when we talked about enzymatic deactivation. Monoamine oxidase breaks down your monoamines. If you need more monoamines, we'll give you a drug called a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. It's going to inhibit this enzyme, so you'll create more monoamines. You get a bigger effect there. It's exciting. Norepinephrine, really involved in that sympathetic nervous system, right? Again, if we're talking about an adrenaline rush, how many of you have ever been, man, I had such an adrenaline rush last night, I went to sleep. No, that's not how that works, right? So when we're thinking about epinephrine, norepinephrine, these are not things that are going to be, whoa, I got all that epinephrine, let's just take a nap. No. I got all that epinephrine, let's go, run around the block 10 times. That's what's going on there, okay? There you go, this is the noradrenergic. Again, we're going to use that adrenaline sort of route there. A ton of places, cerebellum, head up to your cortex, amygdala, right, hippocampus, basal ganglia, again, you're thinking about some movement areas, hypothalamus, right? Okay, we talked about that sympathetic nervous system. Let's get those 4 F's going again by activating that system. Who loves serotonin? Everybody, that's the correct answer. So serotonin, also abbreviated 5-HT, right? Involved in mood, control of eating, sleep, regulation of pain, arousal, right? Fluoxetine is an SSRI, also known as Prozac, right? So it's going to increase your serotonin levels. So if we want to increase your serotonin levels because we want to put you in a better mood, that seems reasonable. The problem is we're going to put you in such a great mood you're going to take a nap, right? So one of the major side effects of drugs that increase serotonin is sleepiness. Start sleeping a little bit more. Here are the pathways again. I guess I should have made clear this is a rat brain. I assumed you read that and realized your head's not shaped like this. But I just want to, some of you might have missed that like 8 slides ago. So here it is, rat brain. Serotonin, got a bunch of origins there for serotonin. Goes a ton of places. Again, there's a ton of overlap, right? In these places where we're sending serotonin. This is why it has such a broad effect when you take these drugs. All right. What about histamine? Who loves histamine? Who loves antihistamine? Yeah, that's great if you can't breathe. The problem, though, is that histamine plays a major role in wakefulness, right? That's why antihistamines will often make people go to sleep. All right. Might be a rare subset of you that take antihistamines and get a little hyper. I don't know if that's anybody. No? It's a real gamble sometimes. Try to give your kids Benadryl so they'll go to sleep. You don't know, right? Sometimes it'll just ramp them up a little. That's why I prefer whiskey. Anytime you want your kids to go to sleep, a shot of whiskey's going to do it. Don't mess around with Benadryl. It's a bad idea. I feel like someone who's responsible in the back should tell me, Casey, that was a bad idea. I'm just going to let it go. I'm just thinking about like whiskey suckers now. It'd be an easy way to get the kid to take the whiskey. I don't know. Does that seem reasonable?
Sure.
It's like a slow release, I guess. I don't know. Maybe you just want to like wind them down. You don't want to put them to sleep. You know, just give them that slow release whiskey sucker. I think there's a market for this. So histamine, definitely going to go up to cortex. That's the one we want to think about because that's where we're going to think about cortex later when we think about sleep-wake cycles, keeping cortex amped up. If you block histamine, cortex kind of goes sleep mode. Not a big deal. Am I going to ask you anything about peptides or lipids? Probably not, except these guys, endocannabinoids. Eventually we'll think about those. Those are sort of, those are lipids, right? Come in and do some business. Your opioids are peptides. Does this really make a difference in your life or in this class? Probably not, right? I'm not going to start asking you like in-depth questions about describe to me why endogenous opioids are peptides and not some other type of neurotransmitter, or what makes an endocannabinoid a lipid. I don't know that that's really the point of this class, but keep in mind there are other things than your sort of standard neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. There are probably 100 different substances that we've identified that alter the activity of your brain cells by way of those receptors, right? We've talked about like 6 of them, okay? Now they're the main 6 or whatever, but there are a bunch more. We didn't talk about like nitric oxide, which we'll talk about later when we talk about learning and memory. We'll add a few things as we need to. Everything we've talked about so far has really been a neurotransmitter. That's been something that's directly been able to open or close an ion channel, right? Directly been able to make that effect happen. A neuromodulator, on the other hand, can't really do anything on its own, but it will enhance the ability of that neurotransmitter to do its business. Now, in practice, I'm not going to ask you about neuromodulators. Okay. Know they exist, know what they do, but that's kind of it. All right, any questions about that?